Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first lecture in the course Competition, Policy and Strategy, which is based on the German course Wettbewerbspolitik und Strategie at JLU Gießen. My name is Daniel Herold, and I gave the lecture in German in 2020. The respective videos can be found on our channel, Economics to Go. And what I'm going to tell you today is something, the basic stuff when it comes to perfect competition and monopoly. But before we start, please make sure that you like the video and that you subscribe to our channel. You would help to support the channel, and this would be absolutely great. So please hit subscribe and thumbs up. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you today is basically, if you think about competition as a straight line, then we talk about the two extremes, perfect competition and monopoly. Everything in between is probably the most relevant and most interesting part, and we're going to talk about this in the next lectures. But we got to make sure that we have the basics right, which is perfect competition and monopoly. So this is what we're going to do today. And before we dive into perfect competition or monopoly, we just have to talk about allocative efficiency a little bit. Right? And we have to make sure that we have a basic understanding of why perfect competition is usually considered welfare optimizing and why we usually think that monopoly isn't, right? And in order to set the stage, we have to first talk about how we as economists work when we talk about a welfare analysis. And an important term in this respect is comparative statics. A comparative static analysis involves comparing two different scenarios. For instance, we could compare monopoly to perfect competition. And we do so by comparing market parameters, such as quantities, prices, welfare, consumer surplus, spending in R&D, whatever, right? And when we do such comparisons, what we have to make sure is that we make a proper comparison. And in order to do so, we have a term that is called ceteris paribus or ceteris paribus, which basically means that we're making a comparison or analysis holding everything else constant, so all else equal. What does this mean? If we talk about a reduction in prices that is charged by a profit-maximizing monopolist, then this would, ceteris paribus, so all else equal, lead to an increase in welfare, right? So why is that important? Thinking back to our Micro 101 and, anticipating some of the things that we're going to learn today, if we are in a situation where a monopolist would, because he's regulated or for whatever reason, charge a price that is equal to average costs, then we know that the monopolist wouldn't make profits. And if in that situation he were to reduce prices, then this would not necessarily lead to an increase in welfare. Fairly simply speaking, because the monopolist incurs losses and would at some point have to leave the market, in which case welfare would be zero, right? So ceteris paribus ignores that, basically, because it says all else equal, no exit or whatever, right? So it's an important term that we have to keep in mind. So when we talk about welfare analyses, we have to set the stage by defining some parameters, right? And our central parameter of interest is welfare. And welfare is defined as the sum of consumer surplus and industry profits. You might recall that industry profits, well, it could be producer surplus. Not necessarily. We will talk about the differences between profits and producer surplus in a minute. Here we're talking about industry profits. So you should know these basic terms from your Micro 101 classes. However, we are just briefly going to recall these concepts. So what is consumer surplus? First, you can look at a single individual and say, okay, this one has a maximum willingness to pay, and there is a price, and the consumer surplus of that individual upon purchasing the product is maximum willingness to pay minus price. So if I were to buy a bottle of olive oil and my willingness to pay would be 20 euros and the bottle costs 15 euros, my consumer surplus would be 5 euros, right? And the consumer surplus in the market is the sum of each consumer's consumer surplus, right? So if there are more than one Daniel in the market and each Daniel would have a 5 euro surplus from buying olive oil, then the consumer surplus would be the number of Daniels times 5 euro, right? When we calculate that, we usually use our well-known price quantity diagram, which we will look at later. Going to the producer side, there is a profit of a single firm, I, so we usually use the index I to indicate a single firm, and pi I is our profits. Then the difference, then the profit is the difference between the revenue and costs. Revenue is basically what the firm earns, and costs are what the firm has to pay in order to produce the good. However, CI could also be opportunity costs, right? So they are, in economic terms, they are always opportunity costs, and they could be production costs, right? Opportunity costs could be production costs, but it could be something else, right? And we are talking about that later. Revenue is fairly simple. It's fairly simple to describe because it's price times quantity, right? And we define the price as P and the quantity usually as Q. So it's P times Q, right? And it's a little bit more complex depending on what we assume that the firms can do, but we will see that in this lecture. Industry profits then, coming from individual profits, is just the sum of each firm's profits in the market, right? Fairly simple. How do we calculate consumer surplus? So first of all, we have to define our respective demand functions, or our demand function basically. Our demand function is a function that tells you the quantity as a function of the price, right? So Q of P. And the inverse demand function is the inverse of this function. So P as a function of Q, right? Quantity as a function of price, demand function, price as a function of quantity is the inverse demand function, right? And we can compute the consumer surplus using both functions. The derivation is a little bit different depending on what we are using, and I just want to briefly illustrate you these two concepts. Look at these two diagrams that we have below here, and what we want to have is basically the blue areas in A and B, right? How can we get there? Well, we can use our inverse demand function, which is the second part here, this is basically what we have in the diagram. So we would go from 0 to Q as a function of P asterisk being our given price that we are trying to analyze consumer surplus at, and take the integral over the demand function, the inverse demand function, and we would have this entire area here. And as we are interested in the blue area, we have to subtract this area here, right? And this area is basically the expenditures of the consumer, right? So we are interested in net consumer surplus, which is the gross consumer surplus minus expenditure, right? And gross consumer surplus would be the blue area plus this the area that we have right here, right? That we could do using the inverse demand function, and we can do that by taking the integral from 0 to Q as a function of P asterisk over P over Q minus P asterisk times Q as a function of P asterisk, right? We could also change the setup a little bit and assume that we just twist this diagram around so that Q is on the vertical axis and P is on the horizontal axis, so just the reverse as we see it here. And then we could use our demand function and just take the integral from P asterisk to A and compute this triangle directly, right? So that would be an alternative. And if A, the maximum willingness to pay, we have it here as an intersection point, but it could be infinity, and then we would have something like this function here. I mean, that's also nonlinear, and in that case, we would just simply do the same, right? So the concept is the same, but mathematically, it's a little bit more sophisticated, right? So anyway, that's how you can compute consumer surplus, and you should know that from your Micro 101 classes. Okay, let's now look at industry profits. We assume that there are n identical firms in the market. So an identical firm, we will see that we will see what that means in a minute, and we use index I to index one of these n identical firms, right? Identical means every firm has the same costs, right? So the cost function Ci of q is the same for all I, so C of q, and the cost function has the form f, which is the fixed cost, plus Vc of q, which is the variable cost. Right, so we will define the cost concepts towards the mid of this video, but until now we should just note that this is variable and fixed cost, which we should know or should recall in some way from our basic classes. We know that every firm is equally well informed, so has access to the same information. So here we assume we have perfect information and no uncertainty. We have homogeneous goods and all other things. So in all respects, the firms are identical. And if the firms are identical in the setup we're analyzing here, we can anticipate that every firm produces the same quantity, right? And if we do that, we can set up, or based on this intuition, we can set up firm I's profits, which is called or denoted pi I as a function of Q, so the output. And this is revenue as a function of the output minus costs as a function of output, and we get to P of Q times Q minus C of Q. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that P is a function of Q, but it depends on what the firms can do. We will see that. Anyway, this is just for illustration, and industry profits in that respect would simply be the sum of all overall I times their respective profits, right? And if we assume that each firm is identical, we just multiply n, so the total number of firms, times the output of a single firm, which is basically the same number, so we could drop the index I here. And there's an important thing to note here, and that is that the industry profits and producer surplus are tightly connected. So we know producer surplus from our micro classes. The thing is that in producer surplus, you just don't have F, so the fixed costs involved. That's why it's important. And we will see what that means when we just define the cost concepts in more detail, right? So fixed costs, we denote by F. They do not vary with output, right? So irrespective of whether you produce 1 bottle of olive oil or 100,000 bottles of olive oil, the fixed costs stay the same, right? And that would be, for instance, the costs, the rents that you have to pay in order to get your production plants standing, basically. On the other hand, the variable costs, C of Q or small c of Q, they vary with output. Right? So if you produce olive oil, then olives would be would constitute the variable cost component, right? And we assume that C of 0 is 0. So if you don't produce olive oil, your variable costs are 0. So our cost function takes the form capital C of Q is F plus small c of Q, and we have to recall some very fundamental cost concepts at that point, because they are very important when it comes to analyzing the two models, perfect competition and monopoly, and also because it's important to understand oligopoly models and so on. And the first concept is the marginal costs, right? Marginal costs are defined as the derivative of the cost function with respect to Q, provided that it is differentiable, and in our case here it is. And what it economically means is basically that this is the costs of production, of producing the next infinitesimally small unit of output, right? What does this infinitesimally small mean? Well, technically speaking, we have differentiated the cost function, which means that we have a very, very small change in output, right? In reality, it's very hard to make a grasp of that because this infinitesimally small is infinitesimally small, right? So every unit that you take could be smaller. And usually in reality, you don't have these real valued changes that could occur, right? So for instance, think about that a production plant that produces planes. So they probably produce like 20, 30 planes a year, and one more plane is no infinitesimally small unit, right? So it's more like if you look at, for instance, olive oil, and there's one drop of olive oil that you produce more, right? So that would be closer to what we think of one of these small units here. The next concept is the average costs. Average costs are basically just the cost function divided by Q. So what does your unit cost on average, right? So if you produce 10 bottles of olive oil, then you want to know what each bottle costs you on average, right? The first bottle might be more cheap because you have much olive oil left and high quality olive oil, and the 10th unit might be more costly because you might need a little bit more of the low quality oil that you have to clean first or whatever, and that might lead to a situation where the marginal costs of the next produced bottle of olive oil slightly increase. But you want to know what does a bottle cost on average. The first one was fairly cheap in relation to the last one, but on average you want to know the number that it costs you to produce the given good. Average variable costs, that's a concept that you might encounter as well. And this is just the variable costs divided by Q. So what is the amount of variable costs that a unit costs on average, right? So another concept that is relevant here. So now, how do you define producer surplus, right? So again, think of a given price P asterisk, and producer surplus would be your revenues basically. So P asterisk times Q as a function of P asterisk minus the area below the marginal cost function. So 0 up to of Q of P asterisk integrated over the marginal cost function, right? And if you integrate the marginal cost function, you get to the variable costs plus an integration constant, right? And that integration constant would be the fixed costs. However, they are not uniquely defined with the function for producer surplus that we have imposed here, right? And that's the point. So fixed costs are not involved in the producer surplus, but they are in industry profits. That's why we use industry profits as our guidance here. To illustrate the concept, look at this slide here and especially at the graphic. And we assume that F here is 0, so that producer surplus and industry profits are the same. So we don't have to make any distinction here. And just assume that accidentally we fix a price P asterisk as the relevant price, and this P asterisk is chosen to be the intersection point between the demand function, P of Q, which is the blue line, and marginal costs, which is the orange line, right? Just accidentally, although we might anticipate that this would be the equilibrium in perfect competition, but we will see that. And here we see the consumer surplus, which is the blue area here, and it's basically just the integral from 0 to Q as a function, Q of P asterisk. over the demand, the inverse demand function minus the expenditure of the consumer, which is P asterisk times Q of P asterisk. This is the area below here. This would be the consumer surplus, and now we look at the producer surplus here, which would be that same area. So here, right, minus the area below the marginal cost function, so below the orange function until this point here, so which would be this area here. And this is basically just the integral over marginal costs with the upper bound Q of P asterisk, right? And then you can analyze these things. Technically speaking, you have it, you have it written down here. So consumer surplus at a given price P asterisk would be this term here, as I've just explained. You take the integral from 0 to Q over the inverse demand minus expenditure, and producer surplus at a given price P asterisk is consumer's expenditure or firm's revenue. So they are the same. I will come to that in a minute, minus the area below marginal costs, right? So again, what we immediately see is that this term here, this P asterisk times Q of P asterisk, it's just a redistribution from consumers to producers. Why? Because what the consumers pay for the good is what the producers get for this product as revenues, right? So this is just reallocation or redistribution of rents, right? So nothing really crucial here. So in terms of our welfare comparison, at least. For our welfare, we take the sum of these two terms, CS and PS, and we just use a certain quantity X here as our variable. So we take the integral from 0 to some output X over the inverse demand function minus the marginal cost function. Why is that? So just sum these two up. This revenues and respectively expenditures cancel out, and that is what you are left with, right? Just with X as your quantity. And now we ask ourselves, for what quantity X, or X asterisk, is welfare maximized, right? And how do we do that? Well, maximization usually takes the form that we differentiate a function, and here we just do the exact same thing. So what we want is to maximize over the choice of X, our welfare function as welfare, which is a function of X, and this is the integral from 0 to X over P of Q minus C prime of Q dq. And we just take that derivative, noting the Leibniz rule of integration, and then we get to the point that at the output where welfare is maximized, we have price equals marginal cost, right? That's a very crucial result. So whenever price is equal to marginal cost, our fairly simply defined welfare here is maximized. That's where we want to get to when we talk about allocative efficiency. And why is that? Well, first of all, we have to get an idea of the concept, right? So what do we do if there was a social planner? He would want to serve consumers until their maximum willingness to pay is equal to marginal cost. So the marginal consumer, the one who just purchases the good, so the last one that purchases, his margin or her willingness to pay is exactly equal to marginal cost. Suppose this was not the case. Suppose the last consumer that purchases the good has a positive willingness to pay. Then you could decrease the price and make another, or then you could just increase the output as another one would be willing to pay for the good above marginal cost, right? So from a social perspective, you could increase output. And this uniquely defined point where price equals marginal cost, it exists because the demand is falling, which is basically a consequence of the diminishing marginal utility of consumption. We have learned that in our Micro 101, and that basically means that the first consumer who is in the market and who is willing to buy the good has a very high willingness to pay, and that is gradually decreasing, right? And our marginal costs have to be increasing, right? So we've just seen the picture here. So we can have increasing marginal costs. So the first bottle of olive oil is less expensive than the last. But if we have a falling demand function and marginal costs would be constant, which in some instances is probably more realistic, then we have a slope of demand function which is like this, and a straight line as the marginal costs, and these functions have to intersect, right? And since they intersect, we again have a well-defined equilibrium here, where welfare is maximized. It's not an equilibrium, but not necessarily an equilibrium, but welfare is maximized at that point. And recall the crucial concept here, which is Pareto optimality, which goes back to Wilfredo Pareto, who lived from 1848 until 1923. And I've taken this definition here from Debru's article from 1954. And he just says that a Pareto optimum is a state where no consumer can be made better off without making another consumer worse off. So that's the idea, right? So you cannot improve one consumer's situation without making another consumer worse off. This would be the, if you are in such a state, then you are in Pareto optimum, right? And what we will just see is that this is exactly the state that we achieve when we have perfect competition. And that's what we're going to do next. So, turning to perfect competition first. What is perfect competition? Take this quote here from McNulty's article from 1968 in the QJE, and he says that perfect competition is basically the only defined concept of competition in economic theory that has no traces of monopolistic elements. What does this mean? And that's basically the first central assumption of our perfect competition thing here, and this is that firms are price takers. Right? This is basically the absence of any monopolistic element in McNulty's definition. Why? A monopolist, he does not take the price as given. Right? The monopolist knows, and that's something that we will learn at the end of this lecture, that the monopolists, upon increasing output, will realize a decrease in prices, or he could directly set the price, right? So the monopolist is no price taker. However, in perfect competition, the firms are price takers. And accordingly, we have many small agents, right? That's called an atomistic market. We have many small producers and many small consumers, and they meet in the market. We have homogeneous goods, right? So there is no quality difference or whatever difference between the olive oils. If we were to assume that our olive oil market is characterized by perfect competition, which it probably is not, but in our fictional olive oil market it is, and we have perfect information, so no uncertainty whatsoever, and we have free access to production technology and free access to the market, so no barriers to entry or exit. We will see what this last assumption means in a minute. However, before we dive into an analysis, we just have to first address that these assumptions sound quite restrictive at first. And that is probably a limitation, of course, right? So you shouldn't take this model at face value and analyze all markets you encounter in real life. That would basically be misleading, right? So the model so first, usually how this model is used is that it is taken as a benchmark to evaluate market outcomes. So assume you have a merger going on between two firms, and then you just compare the outcome of your merger with perfect competition to evaluate whether the merger, how beneficial or non-beneficial the merger actually is, and whether you should block the merger or allow the firms to merge, right? So this is basically how the model is used in theory. in practice, there are some markets where the prediction or predictive power of this perfect competition models may not be too bad at all, after all, right? So if we have markets where we have a huge number of firms active and the products are very easily to be exchanged, right? And there's a lot of interaction in the market, and we have a lot of different consumers and so on and so forth, then the model isn't too bad after all, right? And usually it's assumed for some agricultural markets that perfect competition is a good proxy, and there may be other markets as well, right? So don't think that the model does never work, but you shouldn't also think that the model can be applied to everything, right? So it's a rather small fraction of markets, but again, not it's still relevant in practice, right? So it's not something that you cannot use after all. Okay, so now let's dive into the analysis of perfect competition. So how do we get to we want to know how the market works. So what we're searching for is the equilibrium, right? How do we get to an equilibrium? Well, first we note that the firms maximize their profits, right? So that's usually our starting point. How do firms maximize their profits? And now we get to the crucial point here. So look at firm I, and firm I takes the market price as given, because each firm is a price taker. And that is the crucial step here. Look at the formula. You maximize over Qi, pi i's profit, and this profits is comprised of revenues and costs. Again, we assume that costs are symmetric. And also the revenues here are comprised of P and Qi. And this P here is not a function of Qi in our perfect competition market. Why? Because the firms are price takers. So P is just a constant. It's just a simple number, right? And as this is the case, we can relatively easily get to a solution here, because if we maximize this function, so we differentiate and set the first order condition equal to 0, then we immediately see that we are here in this first order condition where we only have P minus C prime of Qi equal to 0. P is the price, right? And C prime of Qi is the marginal cost, right? So in a profit maximizing situation, a firm sets price equal to marginal cost. So they increase output such that this equation holds. So that's a very important result. First of all, note here that the price as a constant here is equal to marginal revenue in this particular assumption, in this particular market, which is characterized by perfect competition. It will not look like this in monopoly or oligopoly models, usually, right? So marginal revenue equals price, and in optimum, marginal revenue or the price here should be equal to marginal costs. And this optimality we can explain basically by contradiction. So assume that the price would be above marginal costs. What does this mean from a production standpoint for the firm I? Well, if the price is above marginal costs, we note that with the marginal unit, so the last unit we produce, we realize positive profits. So we could gradually increase our output and still realize profits with this, because the marginal costs are lower than the price. So we should expand our output a little bit, right? And we do that until we are in a situation where we can no longer realize profits by producing more, right? And this is exactly met when price is equal to marginal costs, right? On the other hand, if the price was below marginal costs, that means that with the marginal unit, we have realized losses. So if we were to shrink our output, we could increase profits, right? Because we get out of this zone where with each unit we make losses, right? And if neither price above marginal costs nor price below marginal costs can be profit maximizing, then the only situation that could be profit maximizing is price equal to marginal costs. So fairly plausible and intuitive results, I would say. Okay, so now we have to look at two situations, the short run and the long run. In the short run, to determine the overall equilibrium in the market, we have to note that the number of firms is exogenously given. Why is that? Well, basically because we have no market entry or market exit, right? So the markets, as the firms cannot get into or out of the market, and they can also not adjust their capacities, which means that even if there are positive profits in the market on the aggregate level, or if there are negative industry profits, the firms wouldn't be able to enter or leave the market, which also means that positive and negative profits are possible in the short run, right? What does this mean for our equilibrium? Well, we know that each firm chooses outputs such that price equal marginal costs. We can rearrange this equation to get Qi as a function of P, and that's our individual supply function, right? So start at the point where you have price equal to marginal costs, and then you determine the individual supply function. Then you realize that we have n identical firms, and we have one individual supply function, so we just multiply this individual supply function by n to get our industry supply function S of P, right? This is what we call horizontal aggregation. So we just take each individual supply function and we add them up to get an industry supply function. In the short run, we can now determine our equilibrium price by using our industry supply function S of P and set it equal to our demand function Q of P. So the only unknown is P. We can rearrange for price, and the price, the equilibrium price that results is what we call PSR for short run. Based on this price, we can now determine each firm's output by substituting or plugging PSR into our individual supply functions, right? And now we have output and price of a single firm, so we can use the two values to determine profits in the short run. We can also use our individual firm's output in equilibrium to multiply it by n, because that's the total number of firms, to get our industry output, capital QSR. And we can use this to compute our consumer surplus, right? Using the formulas that we have just noted at the beginning of this lecture. Now that we have consumer surplus and individual profits, or here we can easily get from individual profits to industry profits by multiplying by n, we can just plug in the numbers here and compute our welfare in the short run equilibrium. Now that we know how the short run looks like, we now ask ourselves what happens in the long run. And you guessed it, probably the relevant point here is that in the long run, market entry, exit, or capacity adjustments are possible, right? And if they are possible, we cannot have a situation where industry profits are positive. Why? Because if industry profits were positive, another firm outside of the market would realize this positive profits and would enter, right? Because we have assumed that entry is possible. Everyone has access to the market and production technologies. And this entry would lead to a decrease in prices, right? As if there is entry, then we cannot be in a long run equilibrium. On the other hand, if industry profits were negative, there would be firms that would drop out of the market. And if there is movement in that direction, it couldn't be in equilibrium either, right? What this means now is that we have an endogenous number of firms, right? And if we want to solve the system with an endogenous number of firms, we of course have to consider another, defining thing here. And this defining thing is that profits are zero. But before we compute the long run equilibrium, we just have to first talk a little bit about economic profits and accounting profits, because they are not the same. I told you before that we have a cost function here. And this cost function was comprised of fixed and variable costs, right? What we have not talked about yet is the relationship between this cost and opportunity costs, right? So you have learned in your micro classes that for economists, the opportunity cost is the relevant cost concept. What this means is that you should look at what you have to give up when you do something. Basically, that's what defines your activity or your economic decisions, strategic decisions. And to get an intuition, look at a physicist who can do research at a university or work at a regular firm. And if he chooses to work at a university and do research, then he would have to give up on the potentially higher wages that he could earn in a regular firm, right? And this would be his opportunity costs or her opportunity costs. What this means in terms of our example here is basically that the cost concept that we use to compute our economic costs in our models here is basically that these costs involve adequate rents, interest payments, and so on and so forth. And they make sure that the opportunity is covered, basically. The opportunity cost is covered. So if we have economic profits of zero, this does not mean, and it in fact means the opposite, we should have accounting profits that are positive, right? If accounting profits were zero or even negative, then you cannot have economic profits, because then you would really be driven out of the market, right? Accountants have very sophisticated cost concepts that play a role here, and they are very, very accurate when it comes to mapping production into costs. However, our economic costs is a little bit more, less precise and more on a higher level, right? So more sophisticated in a sense. But the thing is that, of course, if you want to compute marginal costs, any cost function in reality, it is much more complicated than just looking at the real, at some balance sheets or whatever, right? So the main takeaway is that if we have economic profits of zero, this does not mean that we have accounting profits of zero, right? Okay, so what does our zero profit condition mean? Basically, it means that revenue is equal to costs. So we just take our profit function here, P times Qi minus C of Qi, and we just take a simple twist here. We multiply and divide by Qi here and factor out our Qi. So we are at this equation here. And for every positive output, so for every term here that is positive, we must have, for this one to be zero, so for our zero profit condition, we have to have this term in parentheses here to be exactly equal to zero, right? And this is given when P is equal to C of Qi over Qi. And the latter term, C of Qi over Qi, that's our average costs, right? In other words, in our long-run market equilibrium, average cost is equal to price. Note that we must have our firms to be profit maximizers still, right? So we must have in our long-run equilibrium that price is equal to marginal cost, as this means profit maximization, plus we must have price equal to average cost, as this is our zero profit condition. In other words, we must have a situation in the long run where average cost and marginal cost intersect. And there's an interesting insight here, and this is that if you are at that point where marginal cost and average cost intersect, and if marginal costs are increasing, that's a technical point which we will come across when we talk about economies of scale later on. So I don't want to dig into much detail here. However, just note that at that point where these two functions intersect, the average costs are minimized. How do we get there? Just take our average cost function, which is C of Qi over Qi. Differentiate this function with respect to Qi over, here we have just dropped the index I, and then you get to this term here, right? So just differentiate the average costs and you get to this expression, and then you search for an extremal point. So set this equal to zero. And since we know that the average costs have a minimum, but the maximums are basically corner solutions in a sense, so the internal solution here is always a minimum, we can just rearrange this equation here, right? So Q squared factors out, as we have just realized that we are dealing with outputs larger than 0, and then we just arrive at this expression here. This expression tells us marginal cost is equal to average costs. What do we learn from here? We have just learned that once average costs reach their minimum, we must be at a point where marginal costs and average costs intersect, right? So in the long run equilibrium, where marginal costs and average costs are the same, we know that average costs are minimized. So we're producing in a minimum of average costs. Okay. So technically speaking, if we want to solve for our equilibrium, we just take the average cost function and the marginal cost function, set them equal, rearrange the resulting expression with respect to Q, and we get our long-run equilibrium output. Just plug this long-run equilibrium output into average costs or marginal costs to get the ensuing price. And once we have equilibrium price, quantity, we can compute profits, consumer surplus, and so on and so forth, right? This is how we get our equilibrium and how it is characterized. Okay, so we have now looked at perfect competition, so one extreme of our competition line. Now let's look at monopoly, so the other extreme. Monopoly is, as we know from our microclasses and as also like common understanding in the media, if you have a monopolist, then you only have one firm on the supply side. Possible reasons for this monopoly would be exclusive access to resources. So if you're the only one who owns a diamond mine, then you're the only producer of diamonds. Pretty clear. You could have a technical advantage or a patent over other that you hold and that prevents others from producing a certain good, right? Straightforward example, look at the COVID vaccines. There was a huge debate in 2021 and also at the beginning of 2022 whether we should drop patent protection for these COVID vaccines, right? Because we had situations where a very large fraction of the world population did not have access to the vaccines, and we wanted to produce as much as possible, but it was discussed whether alleviating patent protection would just make more producers produce the vaccines, and with more vaccines we could have more vaccinations and so on. We would be quicker to get out of the pandemic, right? Another reason for monopoly would be network effects, right? So if you have a social media platform or a search engine that already has like 95+% of all users adopting it, right? We would have a situation where this platform could exert market power. This is a topic that we will discuss towards the end of this lecture, as there are other effects like multi-homing and stuff that could, weaken the monopolists, potential monopolists' market power here. But again, it could be a reason. Note that a pure monopoly situation is very rare in reality, right? Usually we have a firm enjoying market power because it has few competitors, and that's what we call quasi-monopoly, right? That's more realistic. However, the consequence is basically the same, and that's namely that's basically our main thing that we have to take into account when we analyze monopoly compared to perfect competition, and that's that a monopolist can influence price. So a monopolist is not, in contrast to a firm in perfect competition, is not a price taker, right? Before we now analyze the pricing strategy of the monopolist. We just have to notice that if you have a monopoly, you can do much better than to choose a single linear price by using more sophisticated pricing tariffs, so two-part tariffs, for instance. A two-part tariff is a situation where we have a fixed fee. For instance, you have, if you look at the nightclub, then you have an entrance fee and you pay per unit. So you pay for every beer that you consume, you pay a certain linear price, right? So that would be a two-part tariff. And in many situations, a monopolist can do better than charging a single linear price by using one of these two-part tariffs. We do not look at these strategies in detail in this course. This is something that we do, that is done in our IO class, which is in the master studies, and you can find the course on Economics to Go, right? So it's taught by Georg, and there you can also find, so on Economics to Go, you can also find the Economics of Regulation and the Economics of Innovation class, where we talk in much more detail about the regulation of monopolies, which is Economics of Regulation, and about innovation, patents, and so on. That would be Economics of Innovation. So I would highly recommend you to check these courses out and to check these videos out. But you should first get an idea here, and that's why we have this course set up, because we want to set the stage for you to understand these more sophisticated classes. So we first dive into the basics here. So, and to get an idea of these basics, we again look at the equilibrium in monopoly. And again, how do we get to an equilibrium? We have to look at the profit maximizing behavior of a firm, right? And the crucial part here is the price is determined endogenously by the monopolist, right? And the crucial point to notice is that it's really completely irrelevant whether the monopolist chooses its price or its output as an instrument. Why? There is a demand function, and the demand function connects prices to outputs. So if you set an output for your own and you are the sole producer on the market, this determines the price directly, right? And if a monopolist increases output, then the market prices falls, right? So that's the inverse demand function that is falling. If you increase the price, then this will lead to a decrease in sales. That is the falling demand function, right? Okay, and the contrast to that, in perfect competition, each firm was so small that if it produces more or less, it wouldn't affect the price. But here, the monopolist is the only one who does that. So if the monopolist increases output, then this will affect the price, right? Here in our case, again, it's completely irrelevant whether we choose Q or P as an instrument. Let's, in the following example, let's assume that we use Q as an instrument. So the monopolist maximizes profits by choosing output, just to stay in line with our perfect competition analysis. So how does profit maximization look like here? So for a monopolist, we again have the same procedure here. So we maximize over the choice of Q. We don't have to use our index I here because we only have one firm. And we have our profit function pi, which is a function of Q. And we have our revenue part here. And we have our cost part. The latter is not so interesting because it basically looks like in perfect competition, given that we have not assumed a different cost structure. The first part, however, looks different. And the difference is here that the price is not a simple number, but a function of output, right? So here we have our inverse demand function, P of Q, that we plug into our revenue and not just a plain price, P, right? Not a constant. And this affects our first order condition, right? So if we differentiate this function, we have P differentiated with respect to Q times Q plus P as our differentiation, as our marginal revenue, as revenue differentiated with respect to output, right? So this is the first part that we see here. And the second part is just marginal cost. So if we compare that to our former situation, then we notice that the term looks slightly different. So we don't get to such a simple equation as we did in perfect competition, where we just said price is equal to marginal cost. This is not what we have here. So it's slightly more more complex. And this is because the economist, the monopolist has to take into account a price effect and a quantity effect, right? So if the monopolist increases output, then this leads to a decrease in price, right? Because we know that the inverse demand function is falling, right? So if you increase output, then this will lead to a decrease in prices. And what this does is basically that all inframarginal units, so all units the monopolist has sold prior to, or basically even before the increase in output, from those units he realizes less profits, right? However, by increasing output, you sell another unit more. So the marginal unit yields positive revenues. However, the inframarginal, the revenues from the inframarginal units, so those that you would have even if you didn't increase output, from those you earn less because you have to decrease, because the price decreases, right? So that's the price effect and the quantity effect, right? And that drives the decision whether the monopolist increases output or not, in addition to marginal costs concerns. Okay, so there is a mistake here. So this should not be R prime Q, but MC, so marginal cost, C prime Q. Anyway, you've seen that before, and what you get here, or just let me explain graphically first. What you see here, the blue line is the demand function, the inverse demand function, and the green line is the marginal revenue. And we see here that the inverse demand function is linear, which means that the marginal revenue function is twice as steep as the inverse demand function. That's always the case if you have a linear demand function. And if we want to compute our profit maximizing output, we just equate marginal revenue with marginal costs, right? So we just take the intersection point of the green line and the orange line, and this is here. From here, we can just directly compute the monopoly output, and once we have the monopoly output, we can plug this value into our inverse demand function to get our monopoly price. And if we have our monopoly price, we can easily get to consumer surplus, which is this area, so maximum willingness to pay minus monopoly price times monopoly output over 2. And we can get our profits, which is monopoly price times monopoly output minus the respective costs, right? That would be the welfare analysis graphically. And if we look into more detail on this relationship and at this maximizing behavior, what we immediately see, and what is of course extremely intuitive, is that the monopolist's price is above marginal costs, right? That means that the price in monopoly is higher than in perfect competition. It also means that we have a loss in welfare. So profits in monopoly are higher than in perfect competition because prices increase here, and we are in a range where this price increase is profitable, and the consumer surplus is lower. Why? Because consumers have to pay more for their products, right? And we also see that welfare is lower because we have just in the beginning of this lecture, we have just determined that the welfare maximizing quantity is where marginal cost is equal to price, right? And here we deviate from that. So we have higher prices, lower output, higher profits, lower consumer surplus, and lower welfare in monopoly than in perfect competition. So that's our comparative static results, or the results of our comparative static analysis. And that is basically the reason why we don't like monopoly, right? Because it's not good for the economy. Again, we need to incorporate here the term ceteris paribus, right? So depending on the circumstances we're looking at, it might be better to have a monopoly, right? And this is especially true in industries where costs are, or where fixed costs are very high, right? Usual example that we have is, especially in terms of sunk costs, it does not make sense to have 2 sewer systems in a given city, right? So if you were to control the sewer system, you would have to have, or you would want to have a monopoly, and that monopoly should be regulated. And if you regulate the monopoly and just force it to set price equal to marginal costs, well, that wouldn't be ideal, because the marginal cost could then lead to a situation where average costs are not covered, and then it gets more sophisticated. But usually you want to set economic profits of the monopolist equal to 0 by regulation, and then you have the lowest possible price that's still supportable, right? But you can get beyond that. Anyway, this is a topic or discussion that is in our economics of regulation course, very prominent, and you can find it on Economics to Go as well. So another, or the last concept that we look at today is the so-called Amoroso-Robinson condition, right? And if we look at our first order condition, there we had marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And we can rearrange this equation, this first order condition, to get to the point that we have here. On the left-hand side, we have price minus marginal cost over price. And this term is the so-called Lerner index. Very important concept, and we will use that in more detail in the upcoming lectures. And on the right-hand side, you have the inverse of the own price elasticity, eta. Right? And that basically tells you that in the monopoly, at the monopoly price, we have Lerner index equal to 1 over the inverse elasticity. From that you can, and that's a really important equation that is used in empirical I/O to isolate, to back out quantities, prices not, but quantities and so on. You can have structural estimations working like that. And that's very important from a scientific standpoint, but also from a economic theory background. Here you can immediately infer that if you have a linear demand function, then we are pricing in an elastic range of demand. Why is that? Well, assume you have perfect competition. In perfect competition, look at the left-hand side of our equation. We have price equal marginal cost, so Lerner index is 0, right? So breaks down basically. And when we have a linear demand function of that form here, and we have constant marginal costs, then we know that the monopoly price takes this form here, right? So that's just as an exercise. You can just compute for this demand function the monopoly price. That's something that you do in our tests as well. And for that given monopoly price, we see that the Lerner index is smaller than 1, and the elasticity must be above 1. So that means that we are pricing that at the monopoly price, a plus c over 2, we are in an area where the own price elasticity is no smaller than 1. That means we are in the elastic range of demand. So on the last slide here, what you see is the derivation of this Amoroso-Robinson condition in more detail. That's something that I'm not going to go over here in the lecture. You can just look at this when you solve the tests that we have associated to this course. So at that point, we're basically done. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And I hope to see you in the next one.